Good afternoon. Welcome to this month's Lunchtime Lecture Series. I'm Diana Ziegler. I'm the director of the Interior Museum. Before I introduce Greg Boland here, I'd like to do a couple of housekeeping and a little updates here for the Interior Museum. If you walked past our gallery space, you will have noticed that we are dark at the moment. We'll be reopening our next exhibition mid-June, and it'll be DOI Pop, on air, on screen, and in print. So we are exploring the intersection between the Department of the Interior and popular culture, highlighting classic examples from the early 1900s to the present, and across all of our bureaus. Visitors are going to have the chance to see how the department's people, places, have all influenced American identity and figured into television shows, feature films, best-selling publications, and also how the department itself has enlisted pop culture icons in order to help publicize our various missions throughout the years. On your seats, you will have found some evaluations. We look at these. I personally look at them actually each month and take all of your suggestions into account. I know a lot of our audience comes from the Department of the Interior, and I'm sure that you or your colleagues are doing some very interesting, very important work for the Department of the Interior. So if you don't mind jotting down some suggestions for future events, I do take those into account when planning the lecture series. And you can place those lecture evaluations outside. There's a little bin for them on the table. But enough housekeeping aside, I'd love to welcome Greg Boland here. He is actually a second-time lecturer here for the Interior Museum Lecture Series, and we love having him back. He's a biological oceanographer for the Environmental Sciences Division here at the headquarters for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in Sterling, Virginia. He is the Benthic Communities Lead for BOEM Studies for all national regions. He's also the BOEM Project Lead on Deepwater Coral Studies in the Gulf of Mexico and deepwater canyons in the Atlantic. He began his research career at Texas A&M University in the Department of Oceanography in 1974, working primarily on results from manned submersive surveys of topographic features on the Gulf of Mexico continental shelf. Before moving to BOEM headquarters, he worked in the BOEM Gulf of Mexico office between 1998 and 2009, responsible for both fisheries and deepwater community subject areas. Prior to that, he was working in the public sector and spent 10 years at Texas A&M as well. He's participated in 160 research cruises and was an active scientific diver, logging over 2,300 dives. Mr. Boland has a BS in zoology from Colorado State University and an MS in biological oceanography from Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. Please welcome Greg Boland.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody for coming. This will be a talk on one of the studies that was mentioned of deepwater canyons off of the mid-Atlantic, Virginia and Maryland specifically. Deepwater Discoveries is the title. Mid-Atlantic Canyons, Corals, and More. The more will be interesting and exciting. So first of all, I guess BOEM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, is one of the bureaus of Department of Interior. BOEM manages offshore energy and marine mineral, which would be mostly sand, but also gravel production. And since 2005, it also includes renewable energy, such as wind and wave energy. And this is in federal waters that begins at the state-federal boundary that ranges between 3 and 12 miles, but out to the EEZ at 200 miles nationwide. And as is stated in the video, the land that the U.S. is in control of underwater is much larger than all of the land above water of the United States. So the mission of the Environmental Studies Program, and this a little side note, we have, I guess you could call a little job security for the codification of the studies program in the OCS Lands Act, whether BOEM or any other agency continues or not, will be at least be continuing as a studies program dealing with these issues. with our mission to provide the information needed to identify, assess, and manage impacts from offshore energy and marine mineral exploration, development, and production activities on human, marine, and coastal environments. And we were just discussing the right term for our, I guess, a mission statement or maxim or slogan, or calling it's basically condensed down to science for informed decisions. And a little history here. This actually began as a concept when I was in the Gulf of Mexico region. Way back in 2008, the scoping began for the first lease sale in the Atlantic for quite some time, since the 70s and 80s, for offshore Virginia, a small wedge that was determined to be associated with the state of Virginia. And in 2009, in August, some of the partnerships were under development, and I found an old email from Felipe Arzaez with NOAA OER, Ocean Exploration and Research, where we said, at this time, consider the plan a full steam ahead go. The desire is to have a draft procurement package for the competitive components using MMS funds at the time by this December in 2009. A little event in the Gulf of Mexico in April of 2010, and the lease sale scheduled for 2011 was canceled by President Obama. And I was very close to just opening a file drawer and shoveling everything into a wastebasket, knowing for sure that this study was not going to continue, but the wisdom of our associate director and management at the time said, continue with the procurement and full steam ahead. And that's what we did. So the fundamental story of the Northeast and the Northwest Atlantic, you could say, is the features of submarine canyons. There are about 15 and up to 20 or so major canyons. These are just a few of them that are named. This one will show up in the next slide just for reference. But our Virginia lease sale at the time encompassed Norfolk and Washington canyons. And we picked Baltimore Canyon here as a contrasting area with some distance away. So there's some 30 to 40 additional canyons, all these little incisions here on the continental shelf going down into the slope that was created back when sea stand was much lower during ice ages, and erosions from rivers that approached the edge of the continental shelf back then. So the early history, most of these studies funded by even BLM prior to MMS, formed in 1982, was done by a number of groups, primarily Battelle, Woods Hole Oceanographic, and Lamont Doherty. Barbara Hecker is one of the prominent names. And she, I think she's primarily responsible for this contraption here called cheap toe. I don't know if it was all that cheap, but it was considered in a way expendable because it's dragged on the bottom up into these rugged canyon features. And I don't think they actually lost it, but they did hang up a few times, and came up with tantalizing information, the earliest known really, and along with some of the earliest Alvin dives out of Woods Hole, that there was fairly abundant corals in the area. This here is Oceanographer Canyon again, at about 1,000 meters, and with a lot of the fundamental results depicting the canyons as something special, much different than the surrounding continental slope. So we did the competitive procurement, and the partners were in place, actually here at the bottom, a team with essentially 4 different teams inside of USGS for these working tasks or subject areas of benthic ecology, genetics, paleoecology, and microbiology. Were essentially pre-identified and embedded into the statement of work. And this is the first time we've kind of done it this way, where the PIs were actually embedded into the contract itself and treated as equal principal investigators throughout the whole study. And then, as I mentioned, with Felipe and John McDonough and others in NOAA Office of Ocean Exploration and Research, we had an understanding, basically, which was continues to be a unique relationship where we just say, okay, we're going to partner with you guys. Here's a handshake, and we'll press on. And if things fall through the cracks, then we'll deal with that when it comes. But they've always come through. This is a commitment of 3, and it turned out to be 4 cruises, with them providing the research vessels as well as the remotely operated vehicles for those operations. And that essentially was as much funding as our whole contract and all of the funding that USGS provided. And they also have a huge mission for exploration, their general mission statement, as well as a big contribution for outreach and education. So the competition went through NOP, was sponsored by the National Oceanographic Partnership Program. They sent proposals out for peer review, and we also had our own internal technical proposal evaluation committee, TPEC. And the winner was CSA Ocean Sciences out of Florida. And then altogether, there were 17 partners, and with 3 federal agencies. There were 2 companies, of course, the CSA team, as well as the, well, it's not listed here actually, but the company that did the video artwork, and a man named Art Howard. And then, so that was 12 total academic or research institutions in addition. The proposal from CSA, with all those members put together, represented 2 canyons. The complexity of the research proposed essentially limited to 2 canyons, rather than the initial concept was 3 canyons, because of just the box drawn around. This is similar to the Virginia Sail with a little extra extension to include Baltimore Canyon right there. So the proposal said, study these 3 canyons and in between as you deem necessary. So they essentially said Norfolk and Baltimore represents the maximum coverage that we can do canyon-wise, and that's what they did. And the broader objectives of the whole study, really the focus was a lot on the corals themselves, and that's a highlight even now, with the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council is actually still in the process of formulating an Amendment 16, they call it, for protecting virtually all the canyon systems throughout the Northeast, to protect them from fisheries impacts, and their fundamental criteria is the presence of corals. So that was one of the focuses of this study as well, but to understand the distribution and diversity of these kind of communities with the focus on corals. And then we need to know the environmental conditions that result in the observed distribution of these kinds of communities that are sensitive to impacts that BOEM would be interested in for protection purposes. And that way you can predict and have models that would predict where these sort of communities would occur in other canyons or other locations, based on remote sensing and much cheaper methodologies than putting a remote vehicle onto the bottom. And then the archaeology component was something that I had done with a previous study in the Gulf of Mexico with studying Lophelia corals, was to add an archaeology component for the value both as habitat, but also the social and cultural significance of the shipwrecks that we knew to be in that area as well. Just to summarize quickly, some of these are more specific, but they get down more into the weeds there for the type of detail that all of these partners and scientists were looking into. The descriptions of the habitats and their associations with each other, the models that I mentioned on how to predict the occurrence of where corals are going to be, the actual coral biology itself, reproduction, etc. Try to determine some of the sensitivities. They're doing lab experiments as well, bringing corals up and testing them in laboratories under different conditions. A big component was the genetics. We're going to have a special little highlight for the genetics aspect. And a lot of general environmental information, oceanographic, the currents basically, and water chemistry, and then the shipwreck issues, and then education and outreach. No, OER did a big piece of this. but also the North Carolina Museum of Natural Science, and then the video production that we'll get to see a piece of. We'll kind of quickly go through the cruises. There are 4 different cruises highlighting the contributions of NOAA and get a perspective of what kind of effort went into all of these cruises and 3 years of field work. So the first one was on the NOAA ship Nancy Foster, and it was primarily dedicated to multi-beam mapping. There's almost no samples, but this is the kind of product that is produced. This can be expanded into great detail and to figure out where to deploy assets to look for certain sorts of things and do surveys and how to space out sampling stations. And the second cruise was in 2012, again on the Nancy Foster, and that's the first time we used the ROV. This is not a huge one, but it's a moderate size scientific class remotely operated vehicle, ROV. And I have to say this was the cruise that I was on just 2 months before this Atlantic cruise was to be staged for another one of my studies. In July of 2012, we were looking at the Gulf of Mexico deep water platforms at 7 different structures down to 7,000 feet in one of them. And the last one, built in the 70s, Shell's Cognac platform, there was uncharted or undocumented obstructions and things that happened to catch the cable, ROV cable, and as they were retrieving the ROV, only the cable came up and the ROV was stuck down there. So it was sort of urgent to get it back because it needed it for this cruise. And about a month later, well, no, actually just a couple of weeks later, a big oceaneering ship went out with their ROV. That's just the arm of the ROV. For a couple hours work, it was only $90,000. But we got it back, and everything was good. So this cruise was quite a few sampling strategies. These are types of cores. A monocore takes a cylindrical sample of the sediments, a bigger box core. The ROV can do individual push core. You can actually see where you're placing these into the seabed, taking sediment cores out of the bottom. Did 78 of these CTVs. They're water bottles essentially mounted on a frame called a rosette. A lot of trawling, 26 different trawls, and a mooring was deployed, 2 moorings from USGS. These are strings of instruments, including current meters and sediment traps, and 4 benthic landers. These are really fascinating, called observatories in some venues. They're remote vehicles. You just throw them off the ship. They sink to the bottom, and they stay down on the bottom of the canyons for a full year, taking huge numbers of measurements of currents and sediment, deposition, chemistry. There's experiments on settling, microbiology, a whole suite of things that take a long time even to describe. So the third cruise, Big Ron Brown, NOAA ship, super capable, and I think the world-class science ROV, the Jason II from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. So that was in April to May of 13, and all of these numbers of samples, a little bit of multi-beam mapping, and 2 of the landers were recovered. You send a acoustic signal, it drops some ballast weights, it comes to the surface after a couple hours, floats up slowly, and they're serviced. All the data is obtained from the instruments, and they got put back down in order to get a full year's worth of information. So the 4th cruise, this was some modification to the contract in a way because of the Ron Brown, the other cruise scheduling was much sooner than we wanted because it was only, I think, 8 or 9 months. We wanted a full year to catch the spring bloom. This was before the spring bloom, and that was an important part of the cycle. So managed to get arranged for another time in summer after all this happened to go back and get the moorings and the landers with 1 of each missing during that cruise. This is a picture of the mooring, how it looks flotation spheres, sediment trap, current meter, acoustic release. So the mooring I'll tell you about now, it had an interesting turbidity event, like a landslide basically, where it was in one of the canyons. It essentially filled up one of these sediment traps with sediment, made it so heavy that it didn't come up when it was released. But it turned out they picked up a satellite signal some couple of weeks later, after it came up when nobody was there anymore. And luckily another NOAA ship, the Bigelow, had time available to go to where that signal was coming from and picked it up. So they saved the mooring. Now the missing lander, we'll find out about later. I'm going to do three sort of special case interesting subjects other than these major findings, but primarily the big picture was that we found a lot higher density of corals than expected. Some varieties were not even known, from like Norfolk Canyon and Baltimore Canyon. It was a Lophelia, the big reef builder in the Gulf. It had not ever been recorded in either canyon before, and it was seen during this project. A lot of species of fish, 125 species, 9 new records for this whole area. One only known from Greenland before this. And this will be a special case here of a discovery of chemosynthetic seep communities near Norfolk Canyon. And then the shipwrecks will be another special topic here. The benthic landers discovered quite a bit of new information, and some of that's actually still being analyzed. So this is, out of all those other specific objectives, this is like one component of one team. This is a group from Netherlands, NIAS. These hundreds of sediment cores were processed. This shows where the stations were in each canyon, and that sediment chemistry is, you can't see, but it shows percent carbon, nitrogen, phytodetritus related to productivity. And big conclusions for that was that the canyons are very different from each other, but also very different from the surrounding bottom of the continental slope, much more enriched in carbon. So here's one of the big subject areas, is corals. As I mentioned, that's the main focus of the Fishery Management Council, wanting to protect these areas. The trawling, of course, has much more guaranteed impact of a bottom impacting trawl that will basically leave nothing behind. Not knowing that they would want to trawl steep canyon walls, but it still happens if they're not protected by some boundary. So a major finding, I guess, was that they're a lot more common than expected, and they inhabited most areas that had a steep substrate, and particularly at the heads of the canyons. These are some of the ROV transects here in Norfolk Canyon. The ROV dives were in many cases targeted for where one might expect corals, and in this case 100% of all the dives encountered Gorgonian corals with 1,315 records. That's almost as many as all the other records of the area combined. And Baltimore was 83% success of 791 records in 15 of the 18 targeted dives. And then the Lophelia story, that is already a publication by Steve Ross and Sandra Brook. These were seen for the first time. These were not huge, but in a meter or so range of size, and the first time seen in either one of the canyons. They're not common in the canyons, but they do create significant habitat. The fish can live under them, and they provide structure that a lot of other organisms can use. This is a Gorgonian, but you can see the basket stars are utilizing that surface. That's much preferable than the mud bottom. And then a relation to the coral studies is Cheryl Morrison's work. This was a paper or a presentation she did in Ocean Sciences in Hawaii last year. Was the genetic biomarkers of two similar but different species of Gorgonians. It's a little hard concept to get across quickly. It's what's called connectivity, is the analysis of the gene structure in the DNA of these two different corals, you can determine from, if you do multiple samples, you can determine how well they're connected in location, how easily they could and have in the past moved and recolonized other places, how they can interchange and succeed at migrating and living in other places. Now these two corals, and I noticed too, living side by side on the banner, the same two species here. This is Paragorgia, and this is Primnoa, the same on the banner. They're living side by side, and they're completely opposite ends of the scale of connectivity. The bubblegum coral, they call it, Paragorgia, is highly connected, meaning if it would be impacted in one place, say wiped out as extreme, it could easily colonize from other places and get back to that and repopulate. This other one, Primnoa, is the far extreme of the other side, very poorly connected. If it was impacted, it would have a really hard time to be repopulated from another place. So that's fascinating. Why that is, we're just wildly guessing as to how that happens. Nobody knows how they spawn. If the gene, or not the genes, but the gametes float up into different water currents, if they spawn at different times and the currents are different whenever that particular coral spawns, it just can't go anywhere else, or success at settling and living, so nobody knows. So this is the story here of the gas seep discovered by the Okeanos Explorer in November 2012, just before our cruise early the next year. They found numerous gas seeps right up Norfolk Canyon, and shortly after that was 570 more that they published in this paper here just last year. And they think, speculating with the geology and the USGS input of their basic knowledge, that there's probably thousands, tens of thousands of seeps up and down the mid-Atlantic coast. So of course we say we got to go there. As part of our cruise, we diverted some of the ship time to go there. This is the seep habitat, or the seeps, the gas bubbles coming out of the bottom. Nobody knew what was on the bottom. Next to Norfolk Canyon, here's our study area. Lo and behold, extensive gas bubbles. This is methane gas bubbling right out of the seabed in numerous places, and they're huge. Probably the largest methane chemosynthetic communities in the whole North Atlantic. There's two of these communities that they had time to see over 1 kilometer in length, solid living chemosynthetic mussels, and quite a community of other organisms that are associated with those. Pretty exciting. So probably all the other gas seeps, I would expect, have something similar going on the seabed. And the archaeology component was dedicated about a quarter of the effort of the study. We knew that there were these wrecks near at the head of Norfolk Canyon, actually up on the continental shelf, about 100 meters or so. The story behind it, though, makes them historically important. These are German ships that they had obtained, however the process worked, after World War I. So in 1921, this General Billy Mitchell was arguing that he could bomb and sink ships using airplanes. This is the first time anyone thought he was crazy. They had to use big ships and shoot giant shells to sink another ship from the water. So he had, at the time, there's even, in 1921, there was pretty good sized biplanes that could carry big bombs. So he set up these demonstrations, and lo and behold, he blew these things to bits, and they sank pretty easily. And that really, amongst other, I'm sure a lot of other complexities, was one of the main instigating factors for the move to the road of creating the U.S. Air Force. So all of the 6 German wrecks were indeed found and confirmed, their names and locations. This is the cruiser Frankfurt. Another one was covered in these cat sharks. It's an interesting contradiction there. It's a dogfish, but it's called a cat shark. It's chain dogfish, cat shark. And a big grouper using the shipwrecks as a habitat. And this is they do photomosaics. This is a huge cruiser with numerous pictures that are all mosaic together. So they were providing habitat significance. They're all easily nominated to the historical significance register. So our report, just in negotiations for merging all of the USGS chapters into our BOEM report, which I don't know if that's been done before, but usually they have to publish their own thing, get it peer reviewed under their USGS numbers. So we're gonna, like we did with the PIs, mashed them into the contract, we're gonna put their chapters into the BOEM report and only have one report that'll be citable by everybody. They still need their chapters reviewed by their own policies, but that can go on while we're doing our own reviews. So it's going to be like our Lophelia report I did with the Gulf, 600, 700, maybe 800 pages. It's going to be beefy, but individual chapters will be meaningful to different people. And that's getting written now. Start a review phase in July. It'll probably still take till early 2016. So what makes this especially important in the WISE decision, even more wise back then in 2009, the new proposed draft 5-year lease plan of the Mid-Atlantic, even with a 50-mile buffer and some trimmed off the top here, it still includes Norfolk Canyon totally inside of the boundary, and also Washington Canyon. Not that important that we didn't get to that, but Baltimore Canyon is outside of the lease area. But the similarities and differences will be meaningful for decision making as it relates to this lease sale that is now not going to be scheduled until 2021. And a few little end notes. My last talk, I think, was about this subject specifically. Part of the contract is the archiving of all the significant voucher specimens of invertebrates, which everything is. Well, it has some fish, but the bulk of the sample are invertebrates, from myofauna, little tiny animals in the sediments, up to the larger animals like crabs and corals, will be sent to the Smithsonian. We've had this program going for 36 years now, and it's a very significant program that preserves these valuable collections, and expensive in a sense, to allow researchers all over the world to access them forever, basically. This is the record from a few years back of all of the BLM, MMS BOEM sample collections from other studies of the past that are now in the Smithsonian as we speak. And some of the groups are the bulk of their collection, and one, I think, the polychaetes, is the majority of the collections of this Museum Support Center of the Natural History Museum. And they have a direct web page, which is pretty cool though when you go to it. Each of those stations that showed on the other map are shown by these little pins. When you click on one of those, in a lot of cases, well, almost all cases, it explodes into individual sample pins that you click on those that shows a picture of the critter, the description of the animal, where it came from, all of the metadata. So, now the video treat.
If you go to the beach and you walk to the water's edge, you think of yourself as being at the edge of the United States. But you're not, because the land underneath the ocean, extending 12 miles out, is land that's owned by the United States. And the land on the bottom of the ocean, extended 200 miles out, is under the direct control of the United States. So there's as much underwater United States as there is land United States.
One of the dominant features of the Outer Continental Shelf and the Continental Slope in the Mid-Atlantic, that area from Cape Hatteras all the way to Canada, is that The shelf and slope are incised by a huge number of canyons. There are probably 15 or so major named canyons and probably as many as 30 or 40 smaller canyons.
We decided to focus on two of the canyons. Baltimore Canyon, which is off the coast of Maryland, about 100 miles. Norfolk Canyon is further south. It's again about 100 miles off the coast of Virginia.
One of the reasons that Bureau of Ocean Energy Management was interested in this area, particularly off Virginia, is that it's of interest for energy exploration, and perhaps this area may be opened up to oil and gas lease sales in the near future.
Deep-sea corals provide the complexity and habitat for many of the world's fishes. So I'm really interested in understanding what is that balance between tapping into our resources that we need as a thriving civilization, but also protecting these habitats.
These are areas where BOEM is concerned with protecting, and that's the bottom line for the whole crux of the project, is to locate, to describe, and ultimately to protect these biological communities.
It's a small city at sea. We function 24 hours a day, and we're integrating a lot of different kinds of equipment and a lot of different kinds of expertise. So this project was important in a lot of ways in terms of collaboration. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management provided most of the funding for the project. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration provided the ships and ROVs, the remote operated vehicles that we used underwater. And the U.S. Geological Survey provided quite a lot of equipment and personnel that helped with the project objectives.
When you look at a marine ecosystem, you have to do it holistically, just like on land. Every component meets with another component to form the whole.
You can learn so much from each other, and also with the different disciplines. I mean, I'm mainly looking at the sedimentology, while others are looking at the fauna, but there is always a link between all these disciplines.
In what ways have shipwrecks and man-made objects become an essential part of the ecosystem, an essential habitat for fisheries? And is that the case, or is that not the case?
And then there's the geology, what the canyons are shaped like, how that affects the hydrodynamics, how the sediment moves.
Who lives within the canyon sediment environment, and what about the canyon environment influences who's living there?
How far can corals and their offspring disperse in the deep sea? Is basically the deep sea one continuous unit and you can move from canyon to canyon, or is each canyon going to have its own unique fauna?
My work benefits the public by expanding our understanding of biodiversity. The whole spectrum of life are in the microbial community associated with these corals.
65% of the deep-sea corals live in water depths greater than 50 meters. But fortunately, through advanced technologies, such as remotely operated vehicles or manned subs, we've been exposed to this amazing world that lives below the light zone, which we call the aphotic zone, where there's actually thriving ecosystems living in complete darkness.
The first year was simply mapping the bottom of the ocean, mapping the canyons, mapping the geological features, and also looking for and mapping archaeological sites.
Very, very little of the seafloor has been mapped. Every scrap of land has been mapped to some degree, but we are still literally blundering around in the dark, often with the deep sea. So this is the very first step, and those maps help us tremendously in trying to determine where to deploy our more expensive assets.
Chief Bosun, Bridge. Go ahead, Bridge. We are on station for the lander deployment.
A lander is actually an observatory.
A little bit more. Good. Whoa.
In order to really understand what's driving these ecosystems and how the oceanography works around them, we really need long-term data.
Yeah, are you ready, Mike? Yep.
These platforms allow us to do something that is completely impossible, impractical with regular ship time.
It's a standalone object, so we can deploy it and we can leave it for a few days, but also up to a year on the seafloor. And that's great because then we can get data not only of daily variability, but also of like weekly and seasonal fluctuations, because also in the deep sea you have seasonal fluctuations.
It's kind of like sending kids to college. You throw a lot of money in the water and you never know what's going to happen. But the data that comes back is information that we couldn't get by being out on a ship.
All right, get out of the step, go.
Yeah, that was tough, but it went in. I'm tired.
So we put instruments on these landers. We put them down on the seafloor where they sit there and they collect high-resolution environmental data such as current speed, temperature, salinity, turbidity, a whole suite of things.
We get to see in that picture the type of environmental variability that actually influences the animals that we're collecting. The quick views, snapshots of what we see when we're out on a research cruise is not necessarily what's controlling an animal's distribution or its survival or its life history.
As soon as the sun comes up, we'll be bringing up the first lander. They don't float more than about 2 feet above the surface of the water, so especially if we have any sort of seas, you know, we'll need help on all sides of the boat just looking for them.
It's been down for a year now, so more than a year. I think a year and 2 days, exactly. We have a year of data, hopefully. That's going to be the next step to see if it really recorded everything we want. Is that it? I think that's yeah, there it is. There, the yellow float. There it is. Yep.
I think it gets worse. The more you do of them, the more nervous you become. First, then you have confidence in technique, but after a long time you know what can go wrong.
I need just another minute for this drift to settle out.
It's not ranging on them at all. So it's a trial and error. It's the only way we can try. There's no other way than trying for a couple of hours and then it's we give it up. It's done. Lost. Well, it's the risk of the profession. So a little bit of crying and then starting all over again.
Exploration science is what really drives my passion, making discoveries and going places that people have never been.
This is the seep that Barbara Hecker photographed once or twice, probably 20 years ago, and never published on it.
It was very vague and we thought, this is a massive canyon. We have these old coordinates, we have a depth range. We didn't think we were going to find it. And really it's, with limited ROV time, it's a gamble. You know, do you risk an ROV dive and find nothing? Or do you spend an ROV dive and potentially find this wonderful new habitat?
These coal seeps have evolved a very specific community that identifies them from all the other communities. And of all the dives we've made in Baltimore Canyon, this is the only place we or anybody else has seen these dense aggregations of mussels. We're going to continue to explore the canyon to try to look for other seeps. There's indications there might be methane activity in other parts of the canyon. And what a methane seep is basically biologically produced methane gas bubbles up out of the sediments. It's important because we know that there are communities of bacteria, particularly, that use the methane to produce energy. Other animals use those bacteria, so we have now an ecosystem that's called a chemosynthetic ecosystem, whereas most ecosystems on Earth are based in photosynthetic ecosystems. In other words, energy produced by the sun. So these are very important biologically because they're one of the only types of animal life that we know of that are not dependent on sunlight.
Prior to our cruises, there was a ship that went out, the Okeanos, and using multi-beam sonar, they were able to detect bubbles being emitted from the seafloor. Bubbles.
And we had the first opportunity to take an ROV dive down and actually see this seep.
When we first started seeing the indications of that seep, the first mussel shells, the dead mussel shells, it's like this excitement, you know, it's like, we did it, we've got it, we're nearly there. And then this field of live mussels opens up, and it's a fantastic feeling.
It may be the largest methane seep in the North Atlantic Ocean. So it's quite a significant discovery. There were 2 sections of the seep that ran for almost over 1 kilometer of length each.
Our work has found that we see really discrete communities associated with these seeps thriving within the sediments that differ from all the other samples that we've collected within the canyons. So these seeps are really just unique habitats.
These ecosystems are vulnerable because the animals that live on them can only live there. They need that seepage, they need those chemicals, they can't live anywhere else. So they are highly vulnerable to any kind of damage. Once you disturb the seafloor, you take those animals away, they may not come back. These are Lophelia polyps. This is the first time we found this species in the canyon. It's been reported from Baltimore Canyon before, but I don't think anybody's ever taken any footage or seen it visually. We really didn't expect to see Lophelia. That was just amazing. It was a holy cow moment. We know that Lophelia is further south. It's been documented from further north. But these canyons were a gap in the middle that we have now filled. We are collecting environmental data so that we can try and understand the oceanography of the canyons. We're collecting samples for various projects, genetics, reproduction, various isotopes, food webs. There's lots of different objectives, scientific objectives.
Anything we can do that would get some ages on these kinds of beds would be good.
One of the best ways to describe deep sea corals is that they can be considered old-growth forests of the deep sea.
They grow in a shrub-like or tree-like fashion. And just as trees deposit rings, so do a lot of different species of deep sea coral.
We can actually take the coral, the disc, and we can separate the layers into individual bands.
When we analyze the skeleton of the deep sea corals, we're essentially going back in time on a sort of ring by ring basis or on a growth band by growth band basis.
Basically, we're taking a layer of growth, so a time period of that coral's lifespan, and analyzing the chemistry of the coral skeleton, and then interpreting that as what was the environment like at 200 years ago? What was the environment like at 1,000 years ago?
All over the world, shipwrecks form artificial reefs. And those artificial reefs are important parts of the ecosystem. And so BOEM not only wants to understand the historical importance of the sites and the damage that's been done to them, but they also want to understand the role of the wrecks within the broader ecosystem.
We'll be visiting at least 2 more shipwrecks on this cruise, and when we return to the lab, we'll process the material and identify the animals that we find associated with shipwrecks and compare them to the surrounding substrate.
It'd be nice to get a similar view from the other side, coming down and seeing all that fishing gear right up against the bow. The shipwrecks are important for a number of biological species. The sites are major breeding grounds for chained dogfish. Ironically, the dogfish use the nets for their egg casings.
One of the things that's interesting is that there are grouper species that generally is considered to be a southern species that are using these wrecks, and that's a commercially important species and a recreationally important species. So these wrecks, in addition to their historical importance and significance, are providing a tremendous amount of habitat for animals.
See the mola mola? Mola mola. Thurston sunfish. Very cool.
We expected that Baltimore and Norfolk Canyon would be fairly similar to each other.
They aren't very far apart geographically, but there is also a chance that with the channeling of water and currents within a canyon, that each canyon could be fairly unique.
The origins of these canyons is from when sea level was lower and rivers deposited sediment. That's still happening today, where we're getting transport of sediment both from the rivers and the continental shelf. And with the sediment comes organic matter, which is ultimately the food for these corals.
I didn't believe that there would be much difference between the corals that live in these 2 different canyons. So there were a couple of things that kind of surprised me when we actually got to the canyons and were doing this work. The first thing is, not all of the species of coral that we found in one canyon were found in the other canyon.
So we basically looked at 2 octocoral species and found absolutely contrasting patterns of connectivity between those 2 canyons.
And we're seeing really distinct differences between Baltimore and Norfolk Canyon in terms of the communities that are living there, in terms of the sediment fauna. They apparently are related to the organic material that's being supplied to the seafloor, their food source.
One of the things that we found in Baltimore Canyon was the existence of what we call a nepheloid layer. And this is a layer within the water column that consists of organic material that is very, very fine and sort of floats.
Basically, there's a lot of particulates in the water, and it was really concentrated at this one particular depth. And so, oh, well, maybe that's why there were so many corals there. I hadn't thought of that previously.
The presence of that nepheloid layer has a very strong influence on the benthic community beneath it. So this was actually advantageous because it gave us 2 canyons that were morphologically similar, but one that had a very different regime in terms of organic input.
We had some very significant findings to come out of this project. We found over 125 species of fish in the canyons based on our video analysis and our trawl sampling. We found about 9 species, maybe more after we analyzed the data, that were new records for this area. They hadn't been reported from the mid-Atlantic before. One was even from as far north as Greenland. Most of the fisheries surveys are based on trawl surveys, and those trawls can only operate in smooth, sandy bottoms. We're collecting data in areas where people have been unable to sample, so we're getting a lot of information that people just didn't have at all about fish communities, about habitat, about invertebrates, a whole range of things. One of the things that's happening in ocean resource use is that everybody's moving deeper. As we use up resources that are easy to get to, we're going to start exploiting resources that are more difficult to get to, which includes an increasing part of the deep sea. The kind of projects that we do in the deepwater canyons helped us to understand what our impacts may be. If we know what animals are important and what habitats are important to those animals, we can understand what the results might be of removing those habitats or damaging them.
So what that means is that the science of understanding the environment that's impacted by energy development has to move quickly. And we're constantly trying to keep up, if not catch up, with the demands for energy and energy exploitation. And so studies like this are very important because they provide the policymakers and the politicians and the decision makers with the kind of information they need to help the nation fulfill its energy needs and energy requirements.